The warriors that the American army feared most in winter didn't die from the cold. They mastered the cold as a weapon. In this video, you'll discover the winter survival secrets that kept Apache camps fully operational when below-zero temperatures swept across the American West. Techniques so advanced that the American military itself tried to copy them decades later. The Apaches lived in the most hostile territories on the continent, from the deserts of Arizona to the mountains of New Mexico, where winter arrived fast, brutal, and without warning. They were native peoples of America, forged by centuries of adaptation to extremes that killed unprepared men in a matter of hours. And the first secret wasn't in the fire, it came long before it was ever lit. What Hollywood always got wrong about the Apache Indians in winter is almost an insult to anyone who knows Apache history with any depth. On screen, native warriors appear as stoic figures enduring the cold with little clothing, camped in open plains, exposed to the elements as if brute physical toughness were the only resource available. Scenes of enormous bonfires lighting up painted faces, makeshift tents, snow piling up on fragile structures. It's an image that says far more about the limited imagination of Hollywood screenwriters than about real Apache culture. The reality was completely different and immensely more sophisticated. Apache camps were works of adaptive engineering, refined over centuries. Geronimo, the Chiricahua leader who kept the entire American army occupied for nearly 3 decades, never established a bivouac without first reading the terrain's topography the way an architect reads a blueprint. His men could set up a functional, thermally efficient and tactically secure camp in less than 2 hours, even in heavy snow. This wasn't supernatural intuition, it was science passed down through generations, and Apache history built detail by detail over centuries of winter survival in some of the most unpredictable terrain in the American West. The first and most fundamental principle was terrain selection. The Apaches never camped in open plains during winter, regardless of the momentary tactical convenience. They sought south or southeast-facing slopes, positions that received maximum sunlight during the day and were naturally protected by geographical features against the icy winds from the north. Historian Robert Utley, one of the foremost experts on American Indian wars, documented that American military trackers frequently lost Apache trails in winter precisely because the native warriors chose routes that made no sense to eyes untrained in reading terrain, but which used every hillfold and every rock face as natural insulation and thermal protection. The limestone and granite slopes that were abundant in the Arizona Territory and New Mexico were particularly valued. The rock absorbed heat during the day's intense sunlight and released it slowly at night, functioning as a passive thermal reservoir. Camping against a stone wall warmed by the afternoon sun meant having a radiant heater running through the first hours of dawn, precisely when the cold killed the most unprepared men, and when camps lacking this resource recorded their first casualties from hypothermia. The U.S. Army learned this lesson the hard way during the winter campaigns of the 1870s. General George Crook ordered his soldiers to camp in valley floors because they appeared more sheltered from the wind. The results were disastrous. Camps taken over by stagnant cold air that slid down the hillsides and collected in the terrain's depressions, a phenomenon that the Apaches referred to in their oral traditions as the cold that descends like water. The native warriors had known this for generations. American soldiers discovered it firsthand, paying with lives and with operational capacity, destroyed by waves of cold-induced illness. The contrast was documented by American officers themselves, with a mixture of frustration and involuntary admiration. While military camps recorded frequent cases of frostbite and pneumonia, Apache groups passing through the same winters in the same region, with far less industrialized equipment, remained operationally intact. The explanation wasn't in genetics or supernatural resistance to cold. It was in knowledge, in the Apache history of reading and using the environment that American soldiers simply didn't possess. Frederick Jackson Turner, the American historian whose famous thesis on the American frontier shaped decades of historical interpretation, argued that life on the frontier forged harder, more adapted men. What his thesis conveniently left out was that the native peoples of America had already completed that process of adaptation centuries earlier, with a level of sophistication that Western civilization would take decades to begin properly recognizing. Imagine waking up before dawn in an Apache camp in the dead of December, in the Dragoon Mountains of the Arizona Territory, in the year 1872. The elevation was over 6,000 feet. The temperature outside was well below freezing, and the north wind carried snow crystals that scraped the skin like fine sand. In open terrain, that temperature would kill an unprepared man within hours. But inside, the smell that hits you first isn't thick smoke. It's an unmistakable mix: damp earth, pine resin emanating from the branches of the structure around you, hide cured with animal fat, and a thin, controlled thread of mesquite smoke. The temperature inside the structure is clearly above the outside. Your fingers aren't numb. You slept on layers of dry grass and deerskin, not directly on the frozen ground. This wasn't luck. It was the wiki-up, and it deserves far more attention than popular history usually gives it. The traditional dwelling structure of the Apaches was a work of thermal engineering that modern researchers of vernacular architecture still study with respect. Unlike what most people picture when they hear the phrase Indian camps, the wiki-up wasn't a simple shelter of branches thrown together in a hurry. It was a dome structure built with young, flexible wooden poles, preferably willow, curved and interlaced, to form a nearly perfect dome structurally stable even under the weight of accumulated snow. Over that pole structure, strategically layered insulating materials created a multi-stage thermal system. First came the thick grass layers, applied from the bottom up like overlapping shingles to drain water from melting snow. On top of that, dry leaves and tree bark added a second layer of insulation. In severe winter conditions, deer and antelope hide completed the outer envelope, creating a barrier that was simultaneously waterproof and insulating. Vernacular architecture studies applied to similar structures from other native peoples of America estimate that this multi-layer system created thermal resistance comparable to walls with modern composite insulation, achieved without any manufactured materials, using exclusively what the American West's environment offered. The dome shape had nothing aesthetic as its primary function. It was the result of physical logic applied to the circulation of warm air. The heat generated by the small central fire and by the occupants' own bodies naturally rose, circulated along the rounded inner surface of the dome, and escaped in a controlled manner through the opening at the top, which functioned as an adjustable pressure chimney. This flow created a continuous current that kept the interior temperature consistently above the exterior without accumulating smoke. On nights with multiple occupants, which was the norm as the Apaches rarely slept in isolated groups during winter for both thermal and security reasons, the wiki-up could maintain a temperature difference of approximately 10 to 15 degrees between interior and exterior, according to estimates by specialists who studied similar structures from Native American tribes in the region. Anthropologist Grenville Goodwin, who spent extended periods among the Western Apaches and documented their practices in the book The Social Organization of the Western Apache, described with precision how the winter wiki-up was deliberately different from the summer version. The walls were thicker, with more material overlap. The entrance opening created a transition chamber between the cold exterior and the heated interior, functioning as a rudimentary airlock that reduced heat loss each time someone entered or exited. And there was a detail that Hollywood films never show. The floor of the winter wiki-up was a construction in itself. Overlapping layers of dry grass, animal hides, and foliage chosen for its insulating capacity created a floor that prevented the Earth's cold from rising through bodies during sleep. In Apache culture, sleeping directly on the ground in winter was considered actively dangerous, not out of superstition, but out of practical knowledge passed down through generations about a principle that modern physics confirms. The conduction of body heat to cold ground is far faster and more devastating than loss to cold air, because solids conduct heat far more efficiently than gases. Today, when any experienced camper places an insulating pad under their sleeping bag before thinking about the bag itself, they are applying a principle that the Apaches had as foundational knowledge for centuries. The wiki-up was a housing engineering solution that simultaneously addressed thermal insulation, moisture control, ventilation management, and tactical security with entirely local, renewable, and available materials found at any point in Apache territory. In the spring of 1871, General George Crook assumed command of American forces in the Arizona Territory with the mission of definitively resolving what the Army called the Apache problem, the euphemism for the fact that the Apaches continued resisting the occupation of their ancestral territory with an effectiveness that repeatedly humiliated the largest army in North America. Crook was intelligent and adaptable. He quickly realized something his predecessors had ignored. The Apache superiority in winter operations had nothing magical about it. It was knowledge, and knowledge could be studied. Crook made a decision that his fellow officers found deeply controversial. He recruited Apaches as trackers and guides for his own campaigns. These men, who knew the terrain like the back of their hands and read the winters of the American Southwest like a familiar text, became the most valuable asset of American forces. What Crook observed while working with these trackers changed his understanding of the Apache tribe in ways he documented in memoirs and reports, with a candor rare for an officer of his era. The Apache system of environmental reading, which functioned as an ancestral meteorology of extraordinary precision, was one of the first things that impressed any fair-minded observer. The Apaches developed over centuries a set of environmental indicators that signaled in advance the arrival intensity and duration of winters in the American Southwest, the behavior of certain ant species that sealed their entrances differently depending on the severity of the approaching winter, the migration patterns of specific bird species in the Arizona and New Mexico regions that signaled weeks in advance when large snowstorms were coming from the north, the unusually thick skin of certain wild fruits that the Apaches interpreted as a biological response to atmospheric pressures that preceded the major storm systems. This isn't folklore, it's ethnoclimatology, the field of study that analyzes how traditional peoples developed sophisticated climate forecasting systems based on accumulated observation across generations. Ethnobotanist Gary Paul Naban, who spent decades studying the environmental knowledge of the native peoples of the American Southwest, documented dozens of these Apache forecasting indicators and those of neighboring Native American tribes, demonstrating that many of them have verifiable biological basis, that plants and animals respond to variations in pressure, temperature, and humidity in ways that the Apaches learned to recognize with precision long before any Western thermometer existed. In that territory, this capacity for anticipatory reading of winter gave Apache camps a crucial temporal advantage. When winter arrived in force, the Apaches already had wiki-ups reinforced with the extra layers that the season's severity demanded. They had already calculated and stored the appropriate food reserves. They had already identified alternate routes in case heavy snow blocked the usual paths. They had already distributed resources according to group size, making sustainability calculations that most Western settlers simply didn't have the cultural training to execute. Historian Walter Prescott Webb, in The Great Plains, his definitive analysis of the human ecology of the American Great Plains, argues that the great failure of European settlers arriving in the American West was attempting to apply the survival strategies of the eastern forests to a completely different ecology. The native peoples of America, including the Apaches in the Southwest, had specific and tested solutions to the specific challenges of that environment. The settlers arrived with generic solutions to generic problems and paid a steep price for their maladaptation. Cochise, the great Chiricahua leader who guided his nation through decades of resistance against the American advance through the American West, was famous among his own men for one specific ability above all others. He knew how to read the winter before it arrived, and when winter came, his camps were already prepared to receive it not as an enemy, but as a known and manageable condition. The smell of burning mesquite has a particular quality that the riders of the prairies who spent enough time near Apache territory learned to recognize. It's an almost invisible smoke when the wood is perfectly cured and dry, and it's exactly that invisible version that the Apaches preferred for their winter fires, for reasons that went far beyond flavor or custom. In Hollywood films about the history of the Old West, Apache Indians invariably appear around enormous bonfires, tall flames dramatically lighting up faces, smoke rising in dense, visible columns against the sky. It's visually striking. It's completely false. And more than false, it would be tactical suicide in the reality of Apache camps in contested territory. A visible smoke column in the clear sky of the American Southwest could be spotted from enormous distances. It was a positional signal as clear as a nighttime bonfire seen from above. For an Apache group during the frontier wars, producing visible smoke was an invitation for attacks from military trackers, armed settlers, and rival groups. American soldiers, once they learned the technique, actively scanned the horizon for these signals to locate native groups in motion. The Apaches mastered the art of the minimum signature fire. They used specific woods, dry mesquite being the gold standard, that produced intense heat with a minimal amount of visible smoke. The fire inside the wickiup was kept deliberately small and strategic, sufficient to heat the interior of the insulated structure and prepare food, insufficient to produce the smoke plume that would reveal their position. American officer John Bourke, who served as aide-de-camp to General Crook during the Apache campaigns and documented his observations in the book On the Border with Crook, described with admiration the Apache ability to maintain thermally efficient camps with fires that, to trained military eyes at a distance, were simply invisible. When the situation demanded absolute tactical invisibility, warriors used an even more advanced technique: transferred heated stones. Stones of specific composition and size were heated in a small sheltered fire, generally positioned where the smoke naturally dissipated into the vegetation, and then transferred to the interior of the wickiups. The heated stones released radiant heat for hours with no flame, no smoke, no external sign of human presence. It was completely signature-free heating, invisible to enemies, efficient for occupants. Variations of this technique were documented among multiple Native American tribes from different regions, suggesting that the principle had been independently discovered and refined by various peoples facing the same thermal and tactical challenges. Historian Robert Utley, in his meticulous biography Geronimo, describes how minimal fire techniques were particularly critical during the final phases of Apache resistance, when Geronimo and his reduced group, which at times numbered only a few dozen people, including women, children, and elders, managed to evade numerically superior American forces for extended periods in winter mountain terrain. Without the ability to exist thermally without a visible signature, that level of evasion would simply have been impossible. Today, the principles behind the minimum signature fire are taught in extreme environment survival courses, in special forces military training programs from various countries, and in civilian bushcraft programs around the world. Dry mesquite and the class of hardwoods with high caloric density and low smoke production continue to be favored by survival instructors teaching camping techniques in hostile environments. The difference is that today there's a course for it. The Apaches had oral tradition, practice from childhood, and centuries of collective refinement. Food was the third pillar of winter survival in Apache camps, and here the gap between what popular culture imagines about the Apache Indians and what real Apache history records is profound and revealing. The Apaches were not improvised hunters who depended on getting lucky on any given day. They were long-term resource managers with seasonal planning capacity and botanical knowledge of their territory that few Western frontiersmen could come close to matching. In winter, when big game became scarce and unpredictable, and when each hunting trip in intense cold consumed calories that needed to be compensated by the hunt itself, the foundation of Apache nutrition depended on a processing and storage system that began months before the first snow. The Apache equivalent of pemmican combined deer, antelope, or bison meat, dried and ground into a coarse flour with rendered animal fat, usually bone marrow or perirenal fat, and processed wild fruits, especially juniper berries that were abundant in the mountain regions of Apache territory, along with agave-derived products. The result was a compressed block of extremely high caloric density that didn't freeze at winter temperatures, didn't spoil for weeks when properly prepared, was portable during movement, and provided, according to modern estimates by nutritionists who analyzed similar compositions from other indigenous groups, caloric energy equivalent to a full meal in a format that fit in the palm of your hand. It was functionally the predecessor of modern high-calorie military rations, developed centuries in advance out of necessity, observation, and collective cultural refinement. Teddy Blue Abbott, the cowboy who left extraordinarily detailed memoirs about life on the American frontier in We Pointed Them North, recounts the astonishment of men who worked in territories close to those of the Apaches upon seeing how native warriors could maintain intense physical performance in severe cold conditions with amounts of food that would seem insufficient for a grown Western man accustomed to full-volume meals. But the least-known element of the Apache winter diet, and the one that most surprises those who study Apache history closely, was the central role of agave. The plant that white settlers frequently dismissed as ornamental desert flora was for the Apaches a first-rate nutritional resource, especially critical during the winter months in the American West. The heart of the agave, the central part of the plant, dense and rich in complex polysaccharides, was harvested and roasted in underground stone ovens called hornos. The technique required digging a pit in the ground, lining it with heat-retaining stones, creating an intense fire burning for hours to heat the stones, carefully positioning the agave hearts, and covering everything completely with earth to create a slow cooking environment that could last 1 to 2 full days. The complex, relatively indigestible starches in raw agave were converted through the long cooking process into faster digesting and absorbing sugars, creating a product with high caloric content, a sweet flavor, and exceptional storage characteristics. Roasted agave could be transported further dried and kept for extended periods without significant loss of nutritional value. The mezcal pits, the locations where these underground ovens were built and used by the Apaches, are today documented archaeological sites throughout the American Southwest, physical testaments to the sophistication of Apache food processing culture. Archaeologist Carl Laumbach, who extensively studied these sites in New Mexico, documented that the distribution of these locations along Apache seasonal routes reveals a clearly planned and systematic resource management pattern, not opportunistic gathering, but a geographically distributed resource use calendar designed to maximize availability during the critical winter months. The comparison with settlers of the American West is stark and revealing. While poorly planned pioneer camps often faced severe food shortages in their very first winter, depending on external resupply that could fail to arrive for weeks in heavy snow, the Apache groups that had inhabited those same territories for centuries had provisioning systems that distributed risk across the entire calendar and used the local environmental, botanical, and zoological knowledge to identify resources that newly arrived settlers simply didn't know existed. D. Brown, in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, one of the most respected accounts of the history of the native peoples of America, observes with precision that the Apache ability to survive in conditions that periodically decimated entire military units wasn't attributable to any single factor or to any mystical quality. It was the accumulated sum of a complete system: strategic camp positioning, winter-adapted housing engineering specific to that territory, sophisticated fire management, high-calorie food planned months in advance, and fundamentally, a culture that valued survival knowledge as the most honored skill a human being could possess. There was a dimension of Apache winter survival that the American military took decades to begin understanding, and that modern historians of the history of the Old West still debate with growing fascination: the role of calculated movement as an active thermal strategy, and the cultural dimension that made this entire knowledge system transmissible from generation to generation with an efficiency that no written manual could ever match. Kit Carson, the explorer and military officer who spent decades in the American Southwest and knew the territory better than any other non-native of his era, noted in his diaries and reports an observation that remains relevant. One of the greatest difficulties in pursuing Apache groups in winter was that they simply didn't stay still. While American forces established fixed camps and tried to endure the cold at a static point, the standard operational pattern of the conventional army, derived from decades of European wars in completely different terrain and climates, the Apaches moved continuously along routes they knew with a precision Carson described as surgical. This strategic winter nomadism wasn't disorganization or permanent flight. It was the opposite: a deliberate system of thermal and resource management that used movement as an active tool. A group in sustained movement continuously generates body heat through muscular activity. A group stopped in a fixed camp needs structure and fuel to fully compensate for the absence of that movement-generated heat. For groups that used winter as a tactical ally, movement was simultaneously thermal survival and operational advantage. The routes the Apaches used during winter weren't chosen out of superficial familiarity. They were the result of generations of observation and mental mapping of microclimates, the kind of geographical knowledge that existed in no map produced by Western explorers or military men, because it was functional knowledge on a scale of detail that conventional cartography didn't capture. Apache groups knew with precision which canyons accumulated deep snow that blocked movement, and which ones, due to their orientation and geometry, remained relatively clear even after the biggest storms of winter in the American Southwest. They knew where the ground remained thermally warmer due to underground geothermal activity, places where camping meant having the ground as an additional heat source rather than a heat sink. They knew which mountain passes remained passable up to temperatures and snow accumulations that made other paths impassable. This knowledge of routes and microclimates was embedded in oral narratives that combined history, instruction, and collective memory in ways that made learning inseparable from Apache cultural identity. Apache children didn't learn winter survival sitting in formal classes. They learned by following adults along trails from a very young age, listening to stories told around the fire on winter nights. Stories that were simultaneously entertainment, Apache tribal history, family genealogy, and a technical survival manual coded in memorable narrative. Apache culture, comprehensively documented by anthropologist Morris Edward Opler in An Apache Lifeway, published in 1941 and still a fundamental reference in studies on the native peoples of the American Southwest, reveals a society where environmental knowledge was treated with the same prestige that other cultures reserve for religious or military knowledge. An Apache warrior who didn't know how to read the weather in advance, choose thermally efficient terrain, build and heat a wickiup appropriate to the specific winter he faced, or manage the food resources of a group in motion during months of scarcity, that warrior was considered incompletely formed, regardless of his courage or skill in direct combat. This explains a fact that continues to impress historians of the history of the Old West. During the long decades of the Apache Wars, the groups that most effectively resisted the American army were not necessarily the most numerous or the best armed. They were those with the best experts in terrain and winter. Geronimo resisted for so long not because he had more warriors or better rifles, he had fewer of both. He resisted because he knew how to move through the American Southwest in winter with an efficiency that the American army, with all its logistics and equipment, simply could not replicate. General Nelson Miles, who finally obtained Geronimo's surrender in September 1886, wrote in his memoirs that the final campaign was possible only because the army used Apache trackers against other Apaches, men who possessed the same knowledge of terrain and winter survival as those being pursued. Without that native knowledge, the American army was effectively blind in the winter of the American Southwest. It was an extraordinary admission from a general of the most powerful army on the continent. To defeat Apache warriors in winter, you had to think like Apaches in winter. And thinking like the Apaches in winter meant understanding a principle that took centuries to be articulated in Western language, but which the native horsemen of those prairies practiced as second nature. The environment is not an enemy to be conquered by force. It is a system to be understood, read, and navigated with superior intelligence. Cochise died in 1874. In the Dragoon Mountains he loved in his territory, surrounded by his people, one of the few Apache leaders to end his life in freedom. Geronimo lived until 1909, having spent his final years as a prisoner of war at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, but never forgotten. These leaders survived decades of pressure, war, and pursuit in an environment that killed better-equipped and more numerous men, and a considerable part of that survival lay in the knowledge this video explored. Apache camps didn't freeze because the Apaches understood something that Western civilization took a long time to recognize: terrain selection as the first thermal defense, the engineering of the wickiup as a complete housing solution, the minimum signature fire as a simultaneous tactical and thermal resource, high caloric density food planned seasonally, and calculated nomadism as active temperature management. Each element was part of an integrated and sophisticated system that transformed the brutal winter of the American West from a mortal threat into a manageable condition. Today, extreme environment survival instructors teach modernized versions of many of these principles without always acknowledging where they originally came from. Ground insulation, the efficient low smoke fire, microclimate reading, calculated mobility. These are techniques the Apaches refined over centuries, while Western civilization still depended on forts and cities to protect itself from the cold. Apache history is also the history of a knowledge the world nearly lost, and which deserves more than superficial admiration. It deserves study, recognition, and respect. Of the winter survival techniques the Apaches mastered, which one surprised you the most? The strategic terrain selection, the engineering of the wickiup, the minimum signature fire system, or the calculated nomadism as a thermal tool? Tell us in the comments. I want to know which of these techniques you'd try to apply first in a real cold survival situation. If this video changed the way you see the native peoples of America and the history of the Old West, hit like and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we'll explore another aspect of life on the American frontier that textbooks rarely cover. Don't miss it.